speaker who hardly needs any introduction in this field. You may have even read his book on the subject of interactive storytelling. Our speaker is Chris Crawford. He comes to us from the United States today to give us a talk that in some ways summarizes the past 20 years of his research in this area. So please welcome Chris Crawford.
I would like to regale you with tales of my adventures traversing the desert of interactive storytelling over the last some decades. And it all started actually about 30 years ago. And those were early days when microcomputers were 8 bits wide and we programmed them with Flint tools. Alan Kay had come to Atari and he started up a research division. And he asked me to set up a games research group within his decision. Now, there's Alan. Now, Alan was really inspiring. I don't need it. Yeah. Alan was a very inspiring teacher. And one of the best things about Alan was that he challenged me to aim high. One of his famous quotes was, "If you don't fail at least 90% of the time, you're not aiming high enough." And I think in the 30 years since then, I've certainly lived up to that average. But so I didn't know how to begin, though. How do you think big about game design? What's the ultimate? Well, I decided to take a walk out in the Coyote Hills. I spent all day just walking around thinking about, what will computer games be like 100 years from now? And the only idea I could come up with was that computer games would in some way be a medium of artistic expression. Now, what did that mean? Well, fortunately, I was young and ignorant enough to be able to come up with a pretty clear idea of what art is, and that is that art is in some way about the human condition. It's about us. And so I needed to figure out how to do that. So one of the things I realized was that it was not only just the human condition, it was relationships among people, all the different ways that a group of people can interact with each other and so forth. And so, inspired by that, I set off, but computer games, they weren't about people. I mean, in computer games, you chase things. Things chase you. You gobble things. You shoot things. Things shoot at you. You try to avoid being shot by things. It's always things. There were never any people in computer games. And so another question I asked myself then was, okay, if we're going to have people, what would I can't remember what I was going to say. I'm so stupid. Games challenge 4 basic cognitive skills: spatial navigation, resource management, puzzle solution, and hand-eye coordination. That's all they challenge. They don't challenge our linguistic or social skills, any of that stuff. So I asked myself, well, let's go all the way with social skills. What would a Jane Austen game look like? And I thought about that. Try as I may, I just couldn't come up with a good idea of what a Jane Austen game might look like. So I was very frustrated back then. But I was able to at least reduce my thoughts down to a simple bumper sticker slogan. And that was, people, not things. And that basic aphorism has guided all of my efforts ever since then. I've been trying to figure out how to get people into games. And so, with that in mind, I set off on my grand adventure. Boy, I was going to make this work, by gum. And I actually was fortunate in that I stumbled onto an idea that really represented what could be done with the primitive technology and conceptions of that day. And that was the thought that if we boil all human relationships down to just one basic relationship, that's probably affinity. That is, how much two people like or dislike each other. And we could represent affinity by springs. That is, if two people are close together, then they have a short spring, and if they're far apart, they don't like each other, then they have a long spring. But what's neat about this is, if you take a group of people and imagine a spring between each person of the appropriate length, well, it's not going to work right, because some of the springs are going to have to be stretched, and some are going to have to be compressed, and so there's going to be a lot of dynamic tension in the system as a whole. And fortunately, this dynamic tension can easily be represented using a simple relaxation algorithm, all very simple stuff. And so I wrote up the algorithm, and we built it into a game called Gossip. This was in 1983. And in Gossip, all you did was you called up other people and you gossiped. That is, you talked about who likes whom. And so you call somebody up and say, Tom really hates Val, but Liz really likes Dan. And you gossip about this, and the trick is, by manipulating what you say to whom, you can change the lengths of those springs, and if you do it right, you can manipulate it so that you become more popular. And by the way, I have to boast here. I didn't do this. One of my people did this, Randy Smith. But we had absolutely cutting-edge sound in this thing. When you call someone, the telephone rings. That's no big deal. That was easy to do back then. But the really neat thing is, when you call someone, the telephone rings, and they pick up the phone, they said, "Arrow?" That was absolutely blow you out of your seat, cutting-edge sound technology in 1983. So we were very proud of that. Anyway, I then took the technology and I integrated it into a much larger game design. The game was called Excalibur. It was about the Arthurian legends, and the use of the algorithm was much more sophisticated. So, unfortunately, Excalibur and Gossip actually weren't published until late 1983. And Atari collapsed in early 1984, which means they never really were on the market for very long. And as a result, Excalibur and Gossip were both commercial failures. Okay, so I then went freelance. I was laid off from Atari, so I became a freelance game designer. I did a bunch of games through the 80s. And I learned two very important lessons during that time. The first lesson I like to modestly call Crawford's first law of software design. And that is, whenever you set out to design any piece of software, not just a game, any piece of software, the very first question you ask is always, what does the user do? Not what does he see, not what does he hear, what does he do? Because it's not inter-see-ivity, it's not inter-hear-ivity, it's interactivity. It's about action, it's about doing things. That's what's important about software. And so, the way you formalize this concept is with the concept of verbs. You write down a list of verbs that you intend to make available to your user. And that verb list is the skeleton of the entire design on which you hang everything else. That verb list defines the software. In fact, the verb list is such a powerful construct that you can work backwards with it. I can present to you just short verb lists from a few different products, and just by looking at 4 or 5 verbs, you can tell what each of those applications is. Just from 4 or 5 verbs. That's how powerful the idea of the verb list is. And in fact, I applied that concept to my goal of people, not things, and I asked myself, what would a verb list for a romantic thing look like? And obviously, it would have verbs like that. Okay? And what do verb lists from games look like? Well, they look something like that. And as you can see, these two lists have absolutely nothing, remotely or indirectly, in common with each other. They are worlds apart. And so that suggests we got a big problem here, that games just aren't right at all. The second big lesson I learned concerned the importance of faces. And this was driven home to me sometime during the 80s. I was watching a rerun of the original Star Wars movie. You remember that final sequence where Luke Skywalker blows up the Death Star? Man, that sequence, that is... Oh, wait, I'm sorry. But I need to explain some background first. One of the big problems during the 80s was the poor graphics. It was very difficult to get any kind of decent graphics up on the screen. And a good game designer was primarily a person who could get a good image up on the screen. And in fact, I'm sad to say, it is one of the truths of the human condition that the deprivations of our childhood become the obsessions of our adulthood. My parents were raised during the Depression, and so they spent their entire lives chasing financial security. I was raised during the Vietnam years, and so my politics are dominated by the desire to prevent war, and that's just the way people are. Well, the games industry grew up with graphics like that and constantly struggling to get good, not just graphics, all what I call cosmetics. Graphics, music, animation, sound effects. And there was so much deprivation of those that even today, the games industry is still obsessed with cosmetics. Most of their work, if you look at the budget for a typical game, 90, even 95% of that budget goes into the cosmetics. So I was watching the Star Wars conclusion, and I realized, by God, this is a game designer's wet dream. This has action and animation and graphics and sound effects. This is perfect. I mean, we've got roaring turbo lasers and screaming TIE fighters and combat and explosions and all sorts of neat stuff. But while that thought was going through my head, I suddenly noticed that that wasn't all they were showing. In fact, I went back and measured it, and fully half of the screen time during that sequence is not the wonderful graphics, it's the faces. You spend a lot of time seeing Luke Skywalker in the cockpit. That's all he is. It's just a simple headshot, and you're just seeing his face with some emotions on it. You not only see his face, you see the face of other people. You even see the face of Darth Vader. He doesn't have a face, but we still show it because it's important. We see the faces of the bystanders. So it was obvious to me that faces are of immense importance. And in fact, I am lucky that I intuitively sensed that from the outset. Even with Gossip, we had faces showing different emotional expressions. Now when they're, 15 bits wide, you can't show a lot of subtle emotion, but we could get some basics down. Later on, I did a war game. And I don't know why, but I put in a feature where the generals would critique your performance as you were playing. And once again, we had the faces with emotions on them. So, by 1987, all of these ideas came together for me, and I produced the most creative thing I have ever done in my life, and that was Trust and Betrayal. This game was revolutionary, and I do not use that word lightly. Normally we say something is revolutionary if it has a creative leap of some sort. This game had 4 creative leaps. First one, I realized I'd always known you got to list the verbs, but I also realized if you want to have verbs, you got to have other words too. You need an entire language. Verbs don't exist in isolation. And so I designed an entire iconic language, and this is a list of the words in it. You can see there are a lot of empty spaces where I never got around to using the capability. But there were 7 characters in the game, 2 pronouns, nobody and who, 35 verbs. There were an awful lot of verbs in this thing, and they gave the user enormous expressive power. And there were, very different kinds of verbs. You may notice right up here the kill time verb, which means wait. Anyway, there were 7 emotional adverbs. Certain verbs, you could put a spin on the verb, an emotional spin to the verb indicating how you're doing it. There were 7 stages, 1 for each character, representing the home of that character, so you could go visit them at their home. There were numbers. You could quantify things up from 0 to 8. You could ask, how many? And then finally there were 6 words that were unique to the game that I won't bother explaining. Now here's what the screen looked like. It was very simple, but what it did was way beyond what anybody could do back then. Down here in this corner, this is what another character is saying to you. So this sentence says, Kendra greets Vetvel, that's me, angrily, nastily. And in fact, over here, we illustrated the concept with a generic face. We couldn't put emotional expressions onto individual faces back then. That just required too much computing power and too much storage. But I was able to help illustrate it with these generic faces. Up here is where you respond to Kendra, and this brings us to the second big creative leap, and that's what I call an inverse parser. Now the idea was original to me, but I didn't invent it. Texas Instruments actually patented the concept back in 1978, and I'm sure that in the world of computer science this idea has been done many times. The basic idea is to recognize the fundamental problem with parsers. And that is, in a parser you type in your sentence, and then the parser goes through evaluating the components of the sentence and relating them to each other and figuring out what it means. The problem is that you can't have natural language in there, so you have to guess what words and what structures will work, and usually they don't, and so parsers are very frustrating to use. In an inverse parser, you invert that idea. You say, we're going to start off with the first word in the sentence, and then we're going to use the same logic the parser has to calculate what words are appropriate in that particular context. And those verbs are presented in a menu over here. So then you select a verb, and it fills it in, and then it calculates, well, what other words could fit in after this verb, and it presents a menu of those. And so basically you build a sentence word by word using the inverse parser to guide your choices. This, I believe, is a much superior way to present language to a user. So that was the second big leap. Third big leap involved personality modeling. I had contracted with a lady who had a doctorate in psycholinguistics from Stanford to help me about language and psychology issues, and she, of course, advised me of the most popular personality model, as well as some other personality models available in psychology. And we went round and round and had lengthy discussions about personality modeling, and we came to the conclusion, eventually, that these models were useless to us. And the reason why is that this model here models a creature called Homo sapiens, whereas in a story, we have a completely different creature called Homo dramaticus, a character. And characters are very, very different from real human beings, because we human beings, we are rational, we are reasonable, we are mature, we are responsible, and that's why we are so boring. But characters, they do the wild and crazy things that we would never do. I mean, seriously, would you go into the haunted house? Would you fight Darth Vader? Would you volunteer to take the One Ring into Mordor and throw it into Mount Doom? Would you have taken the red pill? No. I mean, characters do things that we would never do. That's what makes them so interesting. And that's what allows us to learn from a story, because the characters, there are all sorts of experiences we never have that characters can have that we can experience vicariously. And that is one of the reasons why storytelling is so powerful. But to do it, you need to model something completely different from a normal human being. And after a great deal of work, we zeroed in on 3 fundamental relationships. These were the symbols used for them in the game. And these represented love, trust, and fear. We found that that 3-dimensional personality model worked. I will not say that it is accurate. It doesn't need to be accurate. It needs to work. And so what I will say is that this is a very good model for the purposes of that. Since then, I've actually experimented with all kinds of personality models, big personality models. I once used a personality model with 20-some-odd attributes. And what I found is they're useless. You can't really use them effectively in a story world. And so nowadays, I have, after all my experience, I have modified these to be goodness, reliability, and assertiveness. And those cover a very broad range of dramatic behaviors. So that was the 3rd big leap. The 4th big leap arose from this problem here. If you're building a language, you obviously want to use the most frequent verbs. But there are a lot of verbs way down the frequency curve, very rarely used, but might be dramatically significant. So you have to establish your cutoff line, but you're missing out on a lot of important stuff. Like congratulate as a verb, that might never be used in a game, but it could be dramatically very interesting. But you can't afford to spend all the time building that verb into your story world with all of its ramifications. Well, the solution I came up with I call the anecdotal interaction. And the idea is that I cooked up a little anecdote, a short story with some interesting dramatic cliffhanger. Cliffhanger is too strong a word. Interesting dramatic problem. And then I gave the player 3, 4 choices about how to react to it, and that in turn went into all the personality equations and affected the development of the game. That allowed all sorts of variety in the game. One of the big problems with any game is that because games are algorithmic, there's a mechanical style where you do the same thing over and over and over. I mean, how many times does a player shoot in a typical game? How many times does he turn right or turn left? I mean, that's done over and over and over and over and over. And it lends a mechanical feel to the experience. These things break up that mechanical routine with one-time anecdotes. Now, some people have said, oh, well, this is really no different from the intermissions in games. What are they called? Cutscenes. Cutscenes, yes. I really am getting old. But in fact, cutscenes are primarily about getting video on the screen. They are not primarily about allowing the player to make dramatically interesting choices. Some cutscenes do give you a choice, but the choices tend to be binary, very simple, and maybe follow a tree at the very best. Whereas these anecdotal interactions actually had their effects going deep inside the personality model. So, Trust and Betrayal was a failure because it was so revolutionary. The problem with being revolutionary is that you're different. And all the game players in the world looked at this game and said, "What the hell is this? I can't even figure out how to shoot anybody." And so they just couldn't get it, and it didn't sell many copies, and bleh. Okay, well, I then did some other games. The only interesting thing about the other games was in one of them, I finally developed a technology for putting emotions on faces. I can't say I really developed it. I stole it from Susan Brennan, whose work in this field was in the early 80s. And basically, I grabbed her technology and used it for emotional stuff. And it worked fairly well. Not really great, but fairly well. However, there was a growing problem for me. And that was that my games were less effective in the games marketplace, and the games industry was less receptive to my ideas. I was a real big shot in the games industry back then, and I had enormous influence, and I was always preaching away, people, not things. And a lot of my games, I published explanations of how the stuff worked so that anybody else could use the ideas. Nobody ever used any of my ideas. And by 1993, I realized that I was going in the people, not things direction, and the games industry was going in the things direction. And I was diametrically opposed to what the games industry was doing. And that led me to give the best speech I've ever given in my life. It's called the Dragon Speech. You can find it on YouTube. It's pretty intense. And in that speech, I basically said, I have to emotionally distance myself from the games industry. I have to divorce myself psychologically from the games industry. And I charged out of the room waving a sword. So anyway, with that, I set to work on a radically new game, and I had no intention of making it commercial. And that game was Le Morte d'Arthur, another game based on the Arthurian legends. And that was really the first game with a true storytelling engine. Trust and Betrayal had a lot of algorithms cobbled together, but this had the first thing that abstracted the whole concept into a specific engine. And I really advanced the face display technology. You can see I made the faces much better. This was the cutting edge, except for what was happening in universities. But in the games world, this was way ahead of everybody else at the time. And I was just working on it for myself, to please my own values. But a couple of semi-retired executives saw this, and they got very excited. They said, "Chris, we got to commercialize this thing. Let's form a startup and get some funding, and let's make a product out of this." So these guys had connections up the wazoo. I mean, they got us into the executive offices of games publishers, movie studios. We really went the rounds. However, we got pretty much the same response from every place we went to, and it's best summarized by one of the VPs who said, "Chris, I really hope you find a publisher for this, because I want to play it. But I can't risk my company's money on something this radical. I mean, I need something more like Myst or Doom." And so, as a consequence, Le Morte d'Arthur was a commercial failure. Okay, so what am I going to do now? Well, at that point, something happened to me that's rare, but it does happen to people occasionally. And that was a case of something coming along that looks like a really wonderful gift, but in the long run turns out to be, well, not quite so good. The Markle Foundation offered me a great deal of money to take my storytelling technology and make it accessible to normal people. They said, build a development environment around your engine that would permit people to build their own stories. And I thought it was a great idea. And I jumped on that bandwagon and seized the reins, and I really rode it hard because, well, I don't know, I just thought it was a wonderful idea to make interactive storytelling available to non-technical people. And so I developed well, I'll call it the third generation of the technology, and that was Erasmatron. And this thing had huge advances on all the previous elements. It greatly abstracted and expanded the engine. It had a scripting system so that you could directly control all the elements. It broke the process of storytelling down in a very rational, reasonable way that could allow you to assemble a story world in an understandable fashion. The face technology was somewhat improved. It really wasn't a big improvement. But this is what the screen looked like. I couldn't find a color version, but this is what the screen looked like. And again, you made choices based on entire sentences. I had abandoned the idea of the iconic language and went to an attempt at a more natural looking language. And I'd done that with Le Morte d'Arthur, and I expanded it here. What you guys call computational linguistics, my fifth grade version of that I called Tinker Toy text. So you could assemble sentences. Anyway, the problem here was that we finished up Erasmatron around 97 or 98, and obviously there wasn't any publisher who was going to sell it, so we made it available on the internet. A great idea, except for the fact that at that time the internet was just too tiny. I mean, Amazon, Google, they were just getting their start at that time. And, they weren't making much money, and they were doing general, broad purpose stuff. And here I was with this very narrowly directed product trying to sell it on the internet, and I think you can see what the result was. Okay, so I decided maybe it was time for me to back off, collect my wits. And so I went off and did some other things. I did some volunteer research for NASA on meteor astronomy. I flew on some airborne missions, did the computer systems and software for them. I was an observer as well. I did a lot of, here's what it looked like on the night of November 17th, 1999. You can't really see it very well. This is a loop, but there are 13 different meteors that show up in the loop. That night I saw something like 3,000 meteors, more than I've seen in my entire life, and I started watching in high school. This was the Leonid meteor storm of 1999. It was absolutely fabulous. And I also helped with, I did the analysis of the video. We had cranked up the gain on the intensifiers to the maximum, so the video was extremely noisy. And I had to develop algorithms that could pick out the landings and the noise. And I got all that working. I wrote a book, and that was fun, so I wrote another book. And that was fun, so I wrote another book. And I also set up a conference called Frontisterion. Frontisterion is a big word for workshop. We did it at my place out in the forest. We had this grove of Douglas firs, and I set up chairs in a circle, and we all sat around, and I sort of stimulated the group into argument, and we had wonderful discussions. I think we did it 5 or 6 times. It was a very nice conference. But then, in 2005, my wife came up with an interesting idea. She observed that there were now a number of successful businesses that were selling subscriptions to games over the internet. That is, the game was hosted on a central server. You didn't sell the game. You sold access to the game, and so a subscriber would pay a monthly fee and would get access to play the game as much as they wanted, and this business model seemed to be successful. So she said, why don't we do that with interactive storytelling? Thus was born Storytron. And we spent a lot of time on the business aspects and lawyers, jumping through hoops, incorporating in Delaware, all of that crap just to make the investors happy. And then we set to work on the technology, and here's what the screen looked like. You will see that this is, the cosmetics of this totally suck. It's what it could do that was interesting. It used the inverse parser in a natural language format, so you would build a sentence step by step until you had a complete sentence. And then you would hit the period to say, that sentence is done. And so you would have a conversation with other characters. One of the things about Storytron was the enormous flexibility you had in preparing verbs and sentences. Here is one example of the sentence that you could, of the kind of sentence you could build in Storytron. I've always felt that deal making is an important part of human interaction. Not just explicit deal making, there's an awful lot of implicit deal making that goes on in emotional relationships. And I wanted to demonstrate, I wanted real power to do deals. This is a more explicit example. Games had had deal making in a simple form for many, many years. That was, I'll give you the sword if you give me 35 pieces of gold. Some of the really advanced games allowed you to say, I'll give you the sword if you'll give me the helmet. But that was as far as they went, a simple swap of thing for thing. I wanted to be able to swap clause for clause. I will do this for you if you will do that for me. Much more complicated, especially in the computational aspects. Enforcement, how long do you wait before the other person is, in violation of the deal, all sorts of stuff like that. I developed all algorithms for all of that stuff, and it was really neat. I could talk for hours and hours about how wonderful Storytron technology was, but I won't do that. Oh, well, I will tell you about this. This was actually not my work. This was Facundo Dominguez, one of my programmers. The guy is brilliant. When he proposed this, I told him, that won't work. That's impossible. Basic idea is you can go through, play an entire story world. And at the end, you got this whole single story. You can ask, wait a minute, why did she slap Paul in the face? And you can go through the list of every single event that took place and open up that event and zero in on the exact basis for that decision, right down to the and or and addition and subtraction. You could take it down to the atomic level and see exactly why the engine made every decision that it made. This was really powerful and very useful, and he didn't do it by storing gigabytes of data. The whole thing was done algorithmically. Absolutely brilliant work. Anyway, so in late 2008, we went out to peddle our Storytron and talk to the investors and so forth. And this is what the headlines looked like. Well, I think you can guess the outcome of that. Okay. So, I think at this point, it behooves me to pause for a moment and contemplate the possibility that there are lessons to be learned from these experiences. And indeed, there are quite a few lessons, 4 of which I think are of some utility to some of you. So let me review those first. First lesson: there is an irreducible minimum complexity to storytelling. That is, storytelling is like nuclear weaponry. You can't make an atomic firecracker. You can't make a nuclear hand grenade. They don't come that small. The smallest possible nuclear bomb you can make is about 9 kilograms of plutonium, and it makes a big, satisfying kaboom! And if you try to make it smaller, you do not get a kaboom. You get what weapons designers dejectedly call rapid disassembly. So, storytelling is the same way. And to illustrate this, I'd like to tell you a story. Itsy bitsy spider crawled up the gutter spout. Down came the rain and washed the spider out. Out came the sun and dried up all the rain. And the itsy bitsy spider crawled up the spout again. That is a complete story in 4 sentences. It has a protagonist, an antagonist, a crisis, a resolution, and an edifying moral principle. All in just 4 sentences, and any 5-year-old in the world can understand that story. Okay, let me tell you another story. Once upon a time, there was a handsome prince who lived in a shining castle atop a mountain. And one day, he leapt on his white charger and galloped out across the drawbridge and down into the forest, where they fell into a hole and they both died. And any 5-year-old in the world can tell you, that's not a story. I challenge you to produce an algorithm that can accept these 2 stories as input and determine which, if any, is a well-formed story and which is not. I ask, when I present that challenge to myself, my response is, I can't even conceive of how I would begin to solve that problem. And so here we are with the simplest possible stories, and we can't even figure out whether they're good or bad. That's what I mean by irreducible minimum complexity. You reduce a story to the absolute minimum, and it is still has spam. Sorry. Let's see. So you just can't make them small enough to be analyzable. Here's another way of expressing the point. I have here an academic journal I would like to present for your consideration. This is my little golden book of Disney's The Little Mermaid. And this thing is all of 22 pages long, and you can see it's mostly nice bright pictures, very little text. Well, I went through this piece of literature, and I counted the number of unique verbs that it uses. And I found that there are 122 unique verbs in this book. Now, let's think about this in evolutionary terms, shall we? The Little Mermaid had 122 verbs. Gossip had 7 verbs. Trust and Betrayal had 35. This is what these things look like on an evolutionary scale. And I think you can see we have a very, very long ways to go before we get this stuff working. So, second lesson. Language. Language is absolutely central to storytelling. You can't tell a story without language. I mean, can you imagine War and Peace without any words? How about Shakespeare as performed by a mime? Or a movie with no dialogue? Ah, wait, I can hear the nitpickers say, what about silent movies? And silent movies had captions. So, actually there is one small group of movies that worked, that had no dialogue at all. my favorite movie of all time, Koyaanisqatsi. I highly recommend it to anybody who hasn't seen it. It tells a complete story and doesn't have a single word in it. Beautiful piece of work. But only a genius could have made that work. So you gotta have language to do storytelling. And there's a problem doing that. That means you've got to put language inside a computer, right? Well, of course, every computer scientist can tell you that is impossible. And they have all these academic explanations as to why, some of them cognitive domains and all of this stuff. But I have a much simpler explanation of why you can't do it, and that is that language mirrors reality. It is an echo of reality, a representation of reality. And you know, reality is, or I'm sorry, if you want to put language inside a computer, you've got to put reality in the computer too. And reality is rather large. You know, how do you define reality? So, no, you can't do full-blooded language on a computer. So if you can't do language, how are you going to do storytelling? Well, as it happens, there is a solution. If you will observe, language is very, very large. But you don't need the Oxford English Dictionary to use the English language. And in fact, we don't need to use every word in the OED just to do storytelling. For starters, we can get away with something much smaller. And so if we build a toy language, something very small, we can and a very circumscribed reality, we can very probably get something small enough to fit inside a computer. So at least that problem has the potential of being solved. Third lesson. This guy here, C.P. Snow, British scientist, in 1958 published a monumental essay entitled The Two Cultures. And what Snow observed was that the Western intellectual culture was bifurcating into two mutually antagonistic subcultures, an arts and humanities and a science and technology. And these two cultures just didn't fit together. In fact, they were very much at war with each other. And he pointed out this was a very dangerous problem, and in fact it really hits us directly in the nose, because to do interactive storytelling you've got to have the science and techie, you got to be able to program, but if you're going to do stories you got to have some sort of artistic sensibility, right? So we need both sides. Now how do we accomplish this? Well, the first approach that everybody tried is the collaboration. And, the problem here is that the techies think in a completely different way, right down at the neurophysiological level. The way techies think is linear, logical, rigorous, sequential. Whereas artists, well, they think in terms of the pattern, the gestalt, the entire thing at once. Completely different way of thinking. And that's why they can't work together. But people have tried collaborations, and they haven't worked because, I mean, all these collaborations always work out the same. The two sides get together and very nice to each other. Oh no, I'm not going to punch you in the nose. Yeah, sure. Let's go out to lunch together, you know. Some of my best friends are artists. This always is done with lots of smiles, but in the end, they never accomplish anything. They work together and they talk and they don't understand each other. I was involved in one of these, and I really liked the lady artist I was working with, and I knew she was smart. I just couldn't understand what she was saying. And she, I would talk and she'd nod her head, oh yes, and it was obvious she didn't understand what I was saying. So collaborations don't work. The second solution many people try is to divide the work up, to have the programmer develop a tool which he then hands off to the artist. And this works well in some fields, that is, in, say, music creation. Programmers have created some excellent tools for musicians to compose and test with. Image creation, you know, Photoshop and all of that stuff, excellent stuff. But it can't work with interactive storytelling because you can't really divide the two parts. That is, the process of building a story world is both simultaneously technical and artistic. And so this method, I mean, this is what I did for years, and it never worked. So that doesn't work. I think the only real solution is to breed a new class of mind that combines both the artistic and the technical in a single mind. And I'll make the brief observation that the two cultures problem is much stronger in the United States than in Europe. In Europe, you're surrounded by art, and so the techies are at least advised that the culture takes art seriously and it can't be dismissed. And so I believe that most of the progress in interactive storytelling will be done in Europe. Anyway, the fourth lesson is kind of complicated and rather difficult to explain. And I will start off by talking about how stories work, giving my definition of a story. I claim that a story is a sequence of events that, taken together as an entire whole, suggest a causal relationship that is significant to the human condition. And so, it's not the events that matter in the story, it's the relationships among the events. Thus, I have bad news for you, for some of you. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, these people never existed. This is a lie. I mean, Luke Skywalker never blew up the Death Star. The evil Emperor never shot lightning bolts out of his fingers. Darth Vader never went... None of those things happened. The entire movie is all lies. So, why do we bother watching it? Well, it's because the events in the movie are not the message of the movie. The message of the movie is the causal relationships that it embodies. That good guys are ultimately successful, and if you're bad, you ultimately suffer failure. And and there are a lot of other lessons in those movies. Every movie has lots of lessons in it. But it's those lessons that constitute the content of any story, not the events. And this is an absolutely crucial realization that is lost on many people. Ultimately, it's cause and effect. That's the content. So, you know, Luke Skywalker gets the gold medal. He doesn't get the girl, but she's his sister anyway. And Darth Maul falls down the bottomless pit. Cause and effect. Bad guys die. As an author of a story world, you don't control the events. You control half of them, but your user controls the other half. And so you can't control the actual events that take place. And a lot of people at this point say, oh my God, there's a problem, a big, big problem. It's interactivity versus narrative structure. How can we let the user do something if he's going to screw up our beautiful plot? And the answer is, that's not a problem. That was solved long, long ago. It's basically just the same problem as free will versus determinism. And if you're well-versed in theology, and you've read St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, or the exchange of books between Erasmus and Luther, you'll know all about how this issue is resolved. The basic idea is to say, well, it depends on your perception of God. If you believe in an interventionist God, then he creates all of the events. You know, he says, this little molecule, I want you to move over there. This little photon, please move a little further along your path. It goes through the entire universe, making everything happen. And that kind of God, there's no free will. because, you know, he's controlling my arms, and so if I walk up and strangle you, God made me do it. And, you know, that's one way of viewing it. But the other way of viewing God is to say God is the grand clockmaker who sets up all the algorithms for the universe, the way causes lead to effects. And then, having built the clock, he winds it up, lets it run. And so if I do something, it's the result of my algorithms, it's my fault. And so there is free will in this type of universe. And so you apply that lesson to interactive storytelling. If you try to control the events, there can be no free will. If you instead control the algorithms, not the events, then you can still control the direction of the story and give your player free will. So, that's the simple solution. Oh, yeah. Here's the same problem is often expressed as, how can I guarantee that the user will have a satisfying outcome? And again, that completely misunderstands what interactive storytelling is all about. That's, you know, the classic problem with any new art form is that everybody's thinking is dominated by the old art form. And that permeates their thinking so deeply that they can't see the obvious about the new art form. In this case, what should be obvious is the fact that a novel is intended to be read once. Yeah, sometimes people go back and reread, but basically, once you know the ending, I mean, it is kind of pointless going back and rereading it. So stories are meant to be told once, but games, they're not that way. They are meant to be played over and over and over, and the player loses and loses and loses. He doesn't have a satisfying experience at first. But eventually the player gets better and better and better and eventually wins. So the player experience is not one pass through the story world. The player experience is many passes through the story world. The player is exploring a dramatic universe of your creation. And the satisfying experience is the discovery of all of the interesting ramifications, the causes and effects, the algorithms that the artist creates in that story world. So stop worrying about events and concentrate on algorithms. Those are the true content of interactive storytelling. And how do you express causal relationships in inside a computer? With an algorithm, of course. But this raises a new problem. It's not the events, it's the algorithms. That's the content. And we've had algorithms expressed in many different ways for many, many years about all sorts of things. And the problem, though, is with a computer, you don't write a book. With a computer, you express the algorithms in an extremely powerful language that can really give you enormous expressive power. And that language is mathematics. And here we encounter the problem number 4. That is, nobody likes math. I hold a master's in physics. I was screwing around with group theory and all sorts of hairy stuff. I hate it. And the reason why we hate math is that math does to the human mind what yoga does to the human body. It forces us to twist our mind around in all sorts of unnatural ways to get anywhere. And that's a very uncomfortable thing. Yeah, there are mathematicians who can do it well, but you know, they're not normal people. So, but the thing is, throughout history, artists have shown again and again that good artists will roll up their sleeves and learn whatever is necessary to pursue their art. And you face exactly the same problem. At this point, you have to ask yourself, am I a technologist or an artist? And if I'm an artist, am I willing to learn the technology required for interactive storytelling? If you aren't, find something else to do. Okay, those are the 4 big lessons. Irreducible minimum complexity, the requirement of language, the 2 cultures problem, and the challenge of mathematics. By the way, good news. When I say math, I don't mean calculus, differential results. Right now, we just have to scratch the surface and see if we can get some little baby stuff working. That's what we should be aiming for. Next lesson I learned is that you shouldn't build the tool before you have the prototype working. That is, you gotta have a working version before you build a tool to develop things. And that was a mistake I made with Storytron and all the other things. I built the tool and not the actual product. That's why the whole Erasmatron thing was a horrible mistake. I shouldn't have concentrated on tools. I should have concentrated exclusively on engines. Another lesson. In 2005, there was a movie released by a game designer called Final Fantasy. This guy had done a series of very successful games, and so he was able to talk some idiots into parting with their money to fund his movie. All game designers really think of themselves as movie makers. Why? Because game designers are fat nerds and movie stars are really cool people. And so they like to think of themselves as movie stars, and they all want to make a movie. And he made that movie. It was called Final Fantasy, and he had, once again, that cosmetics obsession. He had the state-of-the-art computer graphics and animation. And the heroine, the model for her head, had 30,000 separate hairs. At the same time, another movie came out in which they didn't use state-of-the-art graphics. The hero of that movie didn't have any hairs. That movie was called Shrek. Shrek outsold Final Fantasy 10-1, was the basis for a number of sequels. Final Fantasy has been relegated to the dustbin of history, and the moral of this story is that this uncanny valley problem is a killer problem, and you're better off stepping away from trying to achieve the full thing and going to a simpler, more iconic level. And my big mistake was trying to get something that looked like natural language, and I shouldn't have done that. So instead, I'm stepping back to the system I used with Trust and Betrayal. I'm using an iconic language. Here are some of the words in that language, and it has an architecture. And the thing really is, people always balk at this kind of thing and say, oh God, how's anybody going to learn the vocabulary of a language like that? And I want to demonstrate to you that that is in fact not a problem. People always underestimate the facility of language learning inside the human brain. Here are the first 4 sentences of a Peter Pan story, and you can read the translations, and after looking at it for a minute, I think you can see the logic behind it. It is a fairly simple language. If you would like to see the spine-tingling conclusion of this story, there's a URL for you to go look at. It is, it has a very good outcome. So anyway, that's an example of how you can build a toy language that actually works. So I would like now to conclude by giving you one final jewel of wisdom for your edification. Thank you for your time.
Do we have any questions for our speaker?
If you don't disagree with at least one thing I said, you weren't listening.
It seems that right now we have games like The Sims or like Dragon Age. So it seems like the market is more and more open to digital storytelling. So do you think there is space? What do you think of the experiment that commercial games do? Because you of course talk about market in which okay, people just shoot doing the game. But right now we have like Heavy Rain or this kind of game that are at least they are trying to do something, trying to go in a direction.
Yes, the games industry, it's interesting, they're not pursuing people, not things. They're pursuing movies. And they don't bother to understand storytelling or anything. They just want to do cinema. So they want to put some video on the screen. And gee, we can't use video unless we have some kind of story here, so let's hire some hack, have him write up some sort of story to make it interesting. And the story part is not an important part of the overall design. You look at the architecture, you look at the money, the budget, the effort made. They're really not paying any attention at all to the storytelling aspect. They like to talk about the wonderful storytelling elements, but if you actually play the games, the stories are really lame. They're awful, and they really don't give you much choice. In some cases, they do the converging solution thing where they give you a choice, but no matter what choice you make, you still come to the same ending. You know, wow. That's real choice. So the games industry still doesn't get it, and I don't think they ever will. They're too comfortable. You don't change unless you're suffering, and the games industry isn't suffering, so it's just going to keep on doing the same thing over and over until it has enough pain to try something truly different.
And if I have the microphone, so I'll try another question. So what about the generation of story? I mean, I look at your work, there are many, like I do some kind of action, there is a reaction. But what about some proactive generation of story? Because as you say, I think what we do here, especially is there's some kind of story and at a moment you have some kind of choice. And the choice brings you in another node. But all the nodes need to be scripted. So do you talk about, okay, let's generate something totally new. I know that you are not very comfortable with emergent narrative, but there is some kind of meet between emergent narrative and the solution of everything scripted, some kind of edit?
The problem with the concept of scripting is that a script is a designation of a sequence of events. Events aren't the content. The content is the algorithms. So no, you don't want a script. I mean, using a script for a story world is as inappropriate as using a hammer for programming. It's just the wrong tool. So, and tools are very dangerous because the tool shapes the hand of the user. A tool suggests what to do. And so, if you have a tool that says, hey, let's write a linear sequence of events, then that's what you're going to produce. And you're not going to be thinking in terms of algorithms, you're going to be thinking in terms of events. Storyboards are another example. Never, ever, ever use a storyboard because it's absolutely the wrong tool. Yes?
So it seems to me that you say that it's too early to build tools. And also the tools have affordances that somehow create how you have to think about stories.
Yeah.
But there's something missing in between, and this is, I would call story modeling. So not only I would call it, but we had this IRIS project where we had a lot of experiments with authoring. And by end of this year, we will also, maybe we sent around to you some URL where we put some materials online. But the idea was that actually this gap between the writer's mind and the tool is that we first have to build somehow a model of the story, like you said, with relationships, but it's not only the relationships, but the goals of characters and so on.
Yeah.
Of course, they depend on certain architectures, so yesterday it was said also that depending on an architecture, the modeling may be different.
Yeah.
But the skill of building this model, this is something that really does maybe not require technical tools, more conceptual tools.
Well, I would offer as a vague parallel to what you're describing the concept of a storytelling engine, which is a model for how stories operate. And I have built an engine, and it's gone through 4 generations now, and I can tell you that engine is too complicated. So the real task, I believe, in interactive storytelling now is to find the smallest possible engine that still produces a story world that people won't laugh at. I went too far. I mean, my engine has, you can tell lies, you can track down liars, you can give away secrets, you can say this is a secret, don't tell anybody, you can spy on people, you can, characters can anticipate the reactions of others. It has all sorts of wonderful stuff, and that's too much. So I agree that the very first thing, before you design the algorithms that are specific to individual story world, first you had to come up with that model of how the engine is going to work. I strongly agree with that. And the way you break the process of storytelling down into steps is absolutely crucial. It really, it shapes the mind of the user. And I will tell you, my engine has gone through all sorts of trial and error, and there are a lot of things I've learned that just don't work, and I've really polished it. It's a good engine now. So, I've hit the ground so many times, and I'm going to get that Roadrunner next time, for sure, for sure. I'm getting an Acme storytelling engine. So, yes?
Hi, we talked about the reducibility, complexity of storytelling, but to be able to build a system, you have to start somewhere. So I'm wondering what's your thoughts on what are some of the strategies we can use to maybe compartmentalize or abstract our strategies, maybe focusing on different parts of storytelling. Because like the last example you shared to me is a beautiful example of abstraction. Yes. So I'm wondering whether you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, that's a very good point, that if we're going to start small, how are we going to make it small? What types of abstractions do we need to use in order to get things working? Sir, I can tell you one thing is absolutely wrong, because people have been doing this for 20 years and it still hasn't worked, and that is we interactivize a story. Let's take a story, we write down this nice, neat little plot, sequence of events, and then we'll put some branches onto it, just to get a little variation here. Let's do an interactive Romeo and Juliet. And that is profoundly stupid. That doesn't work. You can't interactivize a story in the same way that you can't make an automobile go to the moon just by putting different wheels on it. It's a completely different issue. One of the abstractions, as you point out, is the use of a toy language. A toy language where you really boil things down to the absolute minimum is a crucial element, and here is where the study of linguistics is very useful. I can suggest, for example, if you look at cognates in the Indo-European family of languages, you will discover that there are some words that seem to be really commonly shared in similar form across many languages. Those have to be fundamental words. You can look at frequency distributions. How often do different words show up? Those aren't as useful. Roget's thesaurus. I spent a long time taking his classification. He broke down reality into a taxonomy. And it's nowhere near perfect, but it's damn good. I spent a lot of time taking his taxonomy and reorganizing it and abstracting it down. So one way to do it is take his major level, his top levels, and that's your first level of abstraction. And it won't be enough, so you move one level down. Yes?
So what you've been talking about so far is more representation, like the language you use to do that. But what about the story itself?
Okay.
Do you think there's a way that we can maybe compartmentalize, like, characters, or maybe about just the causal relation of different events.
Okay.
Do you think we can cut this way rather than like representation of content?
First, I would be very careful about trying to separate language from story. Everything we know strongly suggests that language and story are very closely intertwined. You might ask Lynn over here. She can really tell you all about that, wonderful things. So, yes?
So, okay, so it is not inter-tell activity, right?
Good point. Good point.
It is interactivity. So
Yes.
I think that's a wonderful touchstone you've given it. And I hear you've been locked in this dungeon of language all these years, and I've spent some time in the NLP dungeon myself. So I would love to rescue you from it. Why not think about stories as made up of actions?
Oh, yes.
You're using these wonderful cartoons without language. Why not think about those as the building blocks for an interactive storytelling?
Well, in fact, my engine starts off as reactive. I mean, you're right, the language comes at the later point. I was making an academic point with respect to language and storytelling. But the basic engine says there's an event that takes place. We have witnesses to the event. The witnesses have roles that they can occupy that represent different types of responses to the event. And then each role has a set of options associated with it. Simple example, big brother, little brother in the bar, bully starts pushing around little brother, bully punches little brother, little brother plays one role, the direct object of the punch. He has one set of reactions. Big brother is in a different role and has a different set of options. Little brother's girlfriend could be there, and she has a different role. Roles are specified in Boolean terms, but options are separated by arithmetic calculations. We call it acceptability and desirability. So that's the engine. Ha ha ha. In 2 minutes. It's immensely more complex than that, but that's the core.
So you could use your engine to build stories that could be enacted by gestures and actions, and
theoretically
leave out the representation of words.
Yes, the engine is certainly independent of the representation. Yes, you're quite right there.
I think you'd be happier if you did that.
Well, I mean.
Thinking is your Jewish method.
Okay. And I'll have another piece of bread, too. Other question? Yes?
Just to follow up at the beginning, then it went far. If you are moving this idea of the simplicity in the language, and even if we are in our infancy, you appreciate a lot the idea of evolution in language terminology. But my idea, and also I think maybe we can follow your words, and also in the interactive storytelling exercise we are making, we are not pushing somewhere else this complexity. So, for example, taking the idea of the cognitive scientist that tells you about the emotional classification of humans, you see, homo dramaticus is very simple. While we know what hard work actors and animators do on their characters. So I think we are, if you think in terms of an author, we are forgetting the contribution of actors and directors to what is the mise-en-scène, what happens at the end. So I'm thinking maybe we can abstract in telling the story at the beginning, but then when we try to produce something that can be interactable and watch and seeable and hearable, we are trying to make many roles that actually are not in the story but somewhere else. So this complexity somewhere else occurs.
What I think you're saying is that we can augment the computation with human intervention. Is that a quick summary?
I mean, your claim of simplicity or thinking about the algorithm is just putting somewhere else the complexity of the representation in this case. So some of the success of a storytelling is in the flesh and blood of the actors and of the characters that they build themselves and that are not in the story at the beginning.
I see. Well, that's a very advanced issue. I don't think we're going to have to deal with that problem for many decades. That is of such subtlety that we're still working at very primitive levels, and I think, the solution is to get the computer to do it in the long run, but we can't get the computer to do very much.
Well, the comparison you made between Final Fantasy and Shrek,
Yes.
I think was mostly not in the beautiful graphics, but in the expressions, the richness of expressions
Yes.
and emotions that Shrek was communicating. And this
Yes.
is a merit of the animators in most of the cases.
This is what?
A merit, pride of the animators.
Yes,
They made-
yes. Yeah, I agree. There are lots of things that are useful to good storytelling. Then again, novels have none of that, and they're still stories. Now, they're not as good as movies in many people's eye, but there are.
But they have a complexity of language in that case.
Yes, yes. Well, this ties into this irreducible minimum complexity. There really is a lot of complexity in storytelling, and there's no way around that. And as you pointed out, we have a serious problem. How can we abstract it enough that we can get it to a manageable size? And I can tell you from bitter experience, it's really hard. You're going to have to be very brutal with your abstractions and accept a certain amount of stupidity in the stories that emerge. You're just going to have to, we can't do good storytelling right now. Let's just see if we can get plausible storytelling. Other questions?
I think we're out of time for now.
I have one tiny announcement.
Sure.
I'm going to I have to leave at 1 o'clock, so I'm going to spend the rest of the day just sitting out there. So if you'd like to argue about something or whatever, I'll be on call, or more like the guy in the carnival, you throw things